You're watching the Law and Crime Network. Aaron Keller along with you for the afternoon hours here. As always, we just listened to the end of the day in the Matos case. This is a defendant facing the possible death penalty with relation to 4 convictions for first-degree murder. The state proved beyond a reasonable doubt in this jury's mind that he attacked and killed the mother of his child, who was an ex-girlfriend, her father, her stepmother, and also her new boyfriend. All 4 bodies were left in the home, according to the state's theory, and ultimately dumped about a mile from the crime scene in August in Florida. The bodies were badly decomposed when they were found. The medical examiner struggled in some ways to determine the nature and extent of all of their wounds, but this was a scene involving stabbings, beatings, gunshot wounds, just a mix of different causes of death. A difficult crime scene to put together, but the medical examiner on the state's case this morning in the penalty phase of the case said, look, these victims suffered before they were killed. Karen Desoto is an attorney. She's joining us for some analysis of this case. The closing arguments in the penalty phase of this case will be tomorrow. We heard some of the mitigators, some of the aggressors here. It looks like ultimately the defendant is trying to throw every friend and relative onto the witness stand today to argue, well, his life was difficult when he was young.
Right.
Does that really convince a jury that he shouldn't get the death penalty?
Well, unfortunately, not in a case when there's 4 brutal murders. That may help in a case, 1, maybe 2, those mitigating factors, the fact that he was abused as a child, his mother was awful, his kindergarten teacher made fun of him. Those type of things added up, yes, but when you have something that's so horrific, so torturous, and so bizarre in the sense that it wasn't just a shooting, there was asphyxiation, there was stabbing, it seemed that they could have been alive for some time, there was a hammer. So the sheer brutality of it would really renders jurors into the situation where they really have to say to themselves, what was going on in his head? How many times could he have stopped himself from doing this? This isn't 1, this isn't 2, this isn't 3, this is 4 brutal murders, and people are not usually merciful in those type of circumstance. Now, other circumstances, you may have some emotional testimony or look at my life, how horrible it is, that's the reason for it. In this case, however, you don't have that. You have too many murders, too much brutality, and can the jurors see past that? Jurors don't like to kill people, that's true. They don't like to give the death penalty, but in a case like this, you really have to have some persuasive arguments. So short of having experts, short of him having psychiatric help for many months on end, we've seen many murder trials where they have had postpartum depression that has been, you've gone and gotten help, been on medication, and still they have found for the death penalty. So what is going to tip it over the edge in this case? And it doesn't appear that his middle school friend or his relatives are going to be able to make that severe a jump for him.
We saw in some of those cross-examinations that the state is making sure that the friends know every dirty detail alleged to have happened as part of these attacks. And the friends having to backpedal and say, well, I knew that, but I would still support him because he's my friend. Well, you know, look, good for them. They're being loyal friends, but it's another way for the state to remind the jury just how bad these attacks were.
Right, and what a great strategy to actually embarrass the person while they're on the stand. Like, you're here, you're testifying, and aren't you embarrassed? Let me tell you the details. Did you know that he did this? Did you know that he did that? And that's very difficult for a human being to sit there and say, then it's almost like you sleep with dogs, you get fleas. Right? That, well, what does that say about you as a person that you were friends with somebody who did something so horrific, right? Getting them to answer in a manner that's going to be more persuasive towards their case. So that is a strategy that attorneys use, and it's very effective because you really, what could you possibly argue as to the brutality of this?
Not only the brutality, but also the defendant getting on the stand himself and saying, oh, well, I did all of this in self-defense, but then he admits that after incapacitating the new boyfriend, Nick Leonard, to going back and beating him severely. And then he also admits, well, the mother, Margaret, she probably wasn't really out to kill me, but at the time I thought she was, and on hindsight, I shouldn't have killed her. I mean, those 2 statements alone just have to be ringing in this jury's ears.
Right.
And they don't look good for the defendant. So he may have actually harmed himself in that situation.
He definitely harmed himself, and it's interesting because there's many different theories of why. What first is that your client wants to testify, and there's nothing that you can do, and you have to put them on the stand because ultimately it's their decision. And of course, the other strategy is well, it looks like he's going down anyway. Maybe there's something that may happen. Maybe you might get lucky. Maybe they'll feel sorry for him, or maybe he'll be so disoriented or confused that maybe they'll feel sorry for him that he has some kind of mental condition and maybe we should spare his life, right? I mean, it's a strategy, but again, because you have the brutality of this and also you have the bizarre behavior, right? So one of the things that jurors really like is remorse, right? But we didn't really get remorse in this case. What we got was him ordering a pizza and trying to sell the family pets, which again, very bizarre behavior, no remorse there. And jurors, they may give you a little bit of a break if you actually felt a little bit sorry. But again, on top of not one, not two, not three, but 4 murders, and then no remorse, and then the bizarre behavior, really, there doesn't seem to be too many shots for the jurors to feel merciful towards somebody who did something like this.
Yes, and one thing that the state has brought up is his demeanor in court as a possible mitigator.
Right.
But he has shown no emotion through this entire proceeding that we can see, at least when the camera is on him,
Right.
but for the times when his own family is there to testify in his behalf at this late stage of the game.
Right.
He didn't get up there and show emotion about the people that he admitted to killing. He just walked through it very coldly and said, well, I thought they were going to kill me.
Right. So research tells us that when somebody has a cold demeanor, jurors don't like that. We also know that when you're crying and it's your family, but yet you're not, again, not showing remorse for the victims and their families, but for your family, means that I'm sorry that I got caught, I'm sorry that I embarrassed you or shamed you, but that really doesn't have anything to do with the guilt or the victimization of the victims. That actually can go against you because he's crying because he got in trouble. Maybe jurors will perceive it, you got in trouble, you got caught, that's why you're upset and that's why you're crying. Because if you didn't feel that way, then you would have cried during the testimony of the victim's family, or you would have cried during the testimony on the really raw details of what happened, but yet you sat there cold, and unremorseful. And then on top of it, many attorneys will tell you, please don't make emotions, don't make sudden moves, right? They may tell you to do that, and that may be something you may want to discuss during the sentencing phase.
If it were my guess, it would seem, based on the way this unfolded and some of the documents that were filed, some of the decisions that were made, conversations that were had, it would seem to me that the defendant chose to take the stand for himself pretty late in the proceeding,
right.
Probably against his attorney's wishes because he had a criminal record in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And, so some of that can come in. They limited how much of it could come in, but it seemed to be a relatively last-minute decision. It did not seem to be something, well, we think we're losing, let's do it. It just seemed, from what I could tell, that the defendant just chose to do it right at the tail end of the proceeding, and of course his attorneys had to run with it.
Well, unfortunately, when you have clients, sometimes they think that they can talk, I can talk myself out of it. I can give a good scenario, I can give a good story. So you could try and talk them out of it all they want, but in their heads, because they think that their decisions were rational to begin with and that they were acting as reasonable people, then they think that they can actually convince somebody of it. So maybe I can talk to them and maybe they would understand that I was paranoid. Maybe I can bring in this information about how the boyfriend was going there because to protect them, or that he was armed, and therefore maybe my scenario of this situation, even though I've been convicted now of 4 first-degree murders, that maybe they will have some belief towards it and I'll be able to get out of dying myself.
We will never know exactly what went on inside his head or in the conversations he had with his attorneys, but we can sit here and take a guess. I want to go back and listen to some of the testimony of the defendant's mother, who was on the witness stand earlier today at this late stage, this penalty phase of the trial. Here is some testimony from her about one of the mitigating elements that the defense is trying to throw in here, and that is that the defendant had asthma, was back and forth with family issues. Let's listen to some more of her testimony.
Adam has an older brother named Peter,
Yes.
And as you were raising Adam, Peter is how much older than Adam?
They're a year and a half apart.
All right, so if Adam was in, let's just say first grade, was Peter the grade level right above it, like in second grade?
Yes.
And they were close, correct?
Yes.
When you were raising both boys, you raised them together, correct?
Yes.
And when you moved, they moved together, correct?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that in their early portions of their childhood, they had a similar?
Yes.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And you described for this jury that on a number of occasions you moved, correct?
Yes.
And each time you moved, to the best of your ability, you would provide a home for both Peter and Adam.
Yes.
You indicated that when Adam had medical issues like the asthma, you would provide him with medical treatment.
I would take him to the doctors, specialists.
You cared for him, correct?
Yes.
And if he had an issue with the asthma, you did your best to get him the treatment that he needed.
Yes.
His asthma, was it a serious issue?
Yes.
Is that one that he maintained through his life,
Yes.
even into adulthood?
He stopped taking his medication. They would give him steroids.
Okay. He stopped taking it.
Yes.
When there were issues at school, you were an attentive parent and took care of the issues as it relates to the bullies that he dealt with, correct?
Yes.
You met with school officials and kind of explained to them what was going on?
Yes.
And you did your best to address the issues that he was having?
Yes.
And when there were issues in the home, you kind of outlined a number of issues related to your father, their grandfather, and as to your boyfriend. When there was an issue in the home, you did your best to protect them, correct?
Yes.
And you would explain to them when something was done wrong, you would try to explain to them the situation, correct?
Yes.
Try to rear them up the best that you could.
Yes.
And you brought up the situation where Adam Matos finds a marijuana pipe inside the home, correct?
Yes.
And you explained the story, you took that opportunity to explain to him the difference between right and wrong as it relates to that.
Yes.
And you did your best to explain to him the difference between right and wrong, correct?
Yes.
And you would have done that for Adam, and you would also have done it for your other son, Peter, correct?
Yes.
All right. Ma'am, you had an opportunity to view Adam Matos with his son Tristan, correct?
Yes.
And you provided this jury with the opinion based on your interaction with him and his son that Adam was a good father, correct?
Yes.
All right, ma'am. Have you had an opportunity to hear the admissions or the testimony of Adam Matos as it relates to what happened in this case?
I heard the last testimony of Adam.
You heard his testimony, ma'am?
Not all of it.
Not all of it? And you're aware that the things that he's been convicted of are things that he did in the home while Tristan was in the home, correct?
I don't know what happened. I wasn't there.
I understand,
but I
ma'am.
just listened to the testimony.
Well, you know your son. You heard the things he admitted to, correct, ma'am?
Yes.
I guess what I'm trying to ask you, the things that he admitted to, those all happened while Tristan was in the home, correct?
I don't know if Tristan was in the home.
All right, assume for a second that Mr. Matos says that Tristan's in the home while he's doing all the things that he's admitted to, okay? And has been convicted for.
Right.
You with me so far?
If Adam said that,
Yes, ma'am.
then that's what he said.
All right. Knowing that, okay, knowing that he does all these things in the house while Tristan's there, does that change your opinion as to what kind of father that he is?
It hurts any parent. Same thing.
Or is to your opinion of him?
Opinion.
And what kind of father that he is? Does that change your opinion?
Well, any father shouldn't do what he did, of course.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor.
correct?
No, Your Honor.
All right, ma'am, thank you very much. You may step down.
So that was testimony from the mother of the defendant. Her name is Rose Matos. She's Adam Matos' mother. And that ultimately was a wrap-up of her testimony on cross-examination there. So it's been interesting in this case to watch the state sort of force all of these relatives of the defendant to
Right.
admit some of the really bad facts,
Right.
at least from the defendant's perspective, in the case. But facts are facts. How many knife wounds they had, how they were beaten.
Right.
Look, even if the jury believes what your relative, your son, your nephew said, ultimately he was convicted and admitted to some brutal acts.
Right, and especially to do that to somebody's relative, especially their mother, to sit there and have to listen to that type of, well, did you know how many times they were stabbed? Did you, I mean, that really can actually backfire as a prosecutor, because jurors will say, listen, you know, whatever happened, that's still somebody's brother, mother, son, right? So those are things that you have to take into consideration as a prosecutor. How far do you want to go? There's other witnesses that you can actually do that to. Doing it to the mom is a little bit of a different story. So humiliating her on the stand and embarrassing her like that may actually be a bad thing and more favorable towards him. Unfortunately, there's not too many favorable things going towards him in this particular thing, so you really have to give that a little bit different deference as a prosecutor and maybe do that type of thing with the friends, but a mom is a mom is a mom.
Yes, and again, we go back to the question as to whether or not whether the jury rather is going to believe all of these mitigating factors as to whether or not, look, are they really of the essence? Is it of the essence that the defendant had asthma? Is it of the essence that the mother had boyfriends that apparently caused a tumultuous family situation when he was growing up? Is that of the essence? Is it make this defendant's acts excusable?
Well, most jurors, unfortunately, they come with their biases. And lots of jurors have had really hard times and didn't go and murder 4 people. So obviously, prosecutors are going to capitalize like this is just not reasonable. Lots of people have asthma. They're beaten. They're sexually abused, and even in those cases, you don't find them murdering people. So that's that standard, that reasonable person standard with jurors, especially having gone through the voir dire process and maybe having them speak about things that have happened in their family. Jurors have always and always do have touched upon pedophilia, have touched upon divorce, have touched upon medical issues. So they all come in with those experiences, and you have to say to yourself, at what point do you give somebody a pass for 4 brutal murders? And again, this is a really difficult trial, difficult facts to overcome what ultimately was 4 deaths, 4 brutal first-degree deaths.
We know that closing arguments in this penalty phase of the trial will pick up tomorrow morning. The judge was really hoping to get through everything today, but ultimately that's not possible. So since things are going to stretch into a second day, the jury did not want to work late into the evening. The judge held off on the closing arguments in the penalty phase for tomorrow. So we'll have that. We'll have jury instructions tomorrow, and then the jury will deliberate. And I guess it's anyone's guess just how long the jury's going to go. The conviction seemed pretty certain in this case based on every single observer's forethought, and then the jury deliberated 2.5 hours, came back with guilty first degree across the board. Even though it may have been arguable based on the evidence that the new boyfriend, Nick Leonard, it was his gun that was used by the defendant to shoot people. And you know, look, in that fact, it was the worst fact for the state. Some jurors could have, in theory, turned around and said, well, you know, there's some evidence that the boyfriend may have threatened the defendant, that there was a scuffle, that the defendant may have gotten a hold of the gun that way. But, you know, could that have ratcheted it down from first degree to second degree? We batted these ideas around here, but then the defendant opens his own mouth on the stand and says, no, I went back and beat the boyfriend. Well, that turns it into first degree murder. It doesn't turn it into self-defense. So Ultimately, it was a sweep, 2.5 hours of deliberation. Part of me wonders if this next deliberation will be a little bit longer, because it's one thing to convict someone, it's another thing to sentence them to death.
Yeah.
Maybe the jurors will want to go over that with a little bit more discussion.
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
We'll have to wait
Well,
and see.
Thanksgiving is right around the corner, right? So there's going to be a lot of pressure, not just on the jurors, but also on the staff to try and, make sure that they're home for that holiday. And given the nature of the 2.5 hours, 3 hours of deliberation to begin with, yeah, so even if you double it, you're only at 6 hours. So I'm sure that the staff and the jurors can go through this information pretty quickly, because it doesn't appear, a lot of the witnesses were very repetitive, right? Relatives, same type of cross-examination, same type of facts, so a lot of it was repetitive. So this is stuff that they can review in a relatively short period of time and ultimately do their poll and do it in the beginning and then do it after they review it, and we may have a very quick decision here.
Well, ultimately, though, if the jury is hung, okay, if there's one person who says, well, he had a difficult upbringing, let's give him the pass rather, let's not sentence him to death.
Right.
If the jury is hung, it just results in a life sentence.
Right.
If the jury has to be unanimous for the death penalty,
Yes.
That is a high burden, as it should be, but it is a high burden.
Yes, it is a very high burden, but they're also, again, jurors come with their own biases, their own motives, and there may be people who really do, even though you voir dire them and you ask them other questions, that part of this, there may be a sentencing phase. Would you be able to apply the rules and listen to the jury instructions and ultimately make that decision? And people say yes, but it's one thing to say it in a voir dire question or a question. It's another thing to know that you're taking somebody's life. And so whether their religious upbringing doesn't allow for that, even if you do say ultimately during voir dire, do you have any religious predilections to giving the death penalty? No, I'm not really practicing, right? Many people of many faiths are not practicing. But still, that type of religious instruction, even as a child, you're going to be thinking about at the point where you have to ultimately kill somebody.
It's one thing to, as you said, answer the question in the vague sense
Right.
at the beginning of the trial, before you hear the evidence, before you make your mind up as to guilt or innocence. Oh yeah, well, I can objectively determine this, but it is another thing to actually make the decision. Let's listen to some more of the testimony from earlier today in the penalty phase of this case. This is the defendant's brother on the witness stand.
Please state your name and spell it for the record.
Peter DeJesus. It's Peter. DeJesus is Dejesus.
And Peter, do you know Adam Matos?
I do.
How do you know him?
He's my brother.
Were you raised with Adam
Yes, I was.
by Rose Matos?
Yes,
Wait,
Thought you wouldn't have the problem if you're starting to go down. You're not just talking to her, you're talking to everybody, okay?
Right.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
just make sure you speak in a loud, clear voice into the microphone, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. What was your relationship like with your brother growing up?
It's just like any other siblings that you grow up with. We got into mischief. We played together, told each other, normal things that kids tell each other growing up.
We've heard some testimony that you and your mother and your brother, you moved around a lot as kids. Can you talk about approximately how many times you remember moving when you were a child?
I would say at least nearly a dozen times.
Why would you move from place to place?
To have more chances to get nourished by the education system and people around us.
Did you ever move because your mother was in relationships with different people?
A couple times, yes.
Did you guys have a lot of money growing up?
No. We were, I guess some would say poor.
There was actually a point in time, wasn't there, where you were living in your car?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, maybe around when that was?
I would say that was at least when I was around 12 or 13. We were living in Reading. We had gotten into an altercation with my uncle, and he had kicked us out of his house, and we were going to school out in Reading, so we were staying in our car for a few winter nights.
And how old would your brother have been at that point in time?
About 11, 10.
We've heard some testimony about Adam and you getting bullied as you were growing up. Can you talk a little bit about that, some incidents that you might remember?
Well, I guess, it happens, often, whether you live in a town for so many years or just a couple of years. But it happened quite frequently from school to school, either due to racism or just being the new kids in the school.
You said either due to racism or being the new kids in school.
Correct.
Was the bullying ever physical? Were you ever hit or punched, anything like that?
Yes.
At one point in time, I think your mother and you and your brother, you lived with a doctor, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you remember his name?
It's Anthony Desoto.
And how long did you live with Anthony Desoto?
We had lived with him for at least, I want to say 6 years maybe.
What was your relationship like with Mr. Desoto?
It wasn't very common like, say, stepdad or stepson. It was just more or less an acquaintance-like relationship.
Did he ever have any issues with your mother? Did you ever see any physical violence between them?
I remember them arguing many times about their relationship and I guess cheating on her.
Was there a point in time while you were living with Mr. Desoto that you actually went and lived somewhere else?
Yes, I had lived with my father for 2 instances, a year, I guess, time frame each.
Do you know about how old you were when that happened?
I want to say maybe 11.
Now, when you say your father, you don't share a father with Adam, is that right?
And that's correct.
When did you first develop a relationship with your dad?
It was around that time, around 11. I had just met him at the time and spent a year with him and his family here in Florida.
When you went to live with your father, did Adam come with you?
No, he did not.
Did he develop any kind of relationship with your dad?
No, not really.
When you moved back, had anything changed in your relationship with Adam?
It seemed like he was a little bit more distant, a little bit more standoffish in a way, I guess you could say. We weren't communicating like we had before I had left or spent some time with my father.
Is that something that continued forward in your lives?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. I think there was an incident where I think you might have been around 7 or 8 years old. Your brother was around 5 or 6. There was a problem between your mother and your grandfather. Do you remember that incident?
I do.
Can you tell us about that?
I remember my grandfather attacking my mother and my brother and I coming to her aid and trying to stop the altercation.
And did you physically get involved in that altercation?
I believe I had jumped on his back and my brother had attached himself to his ankle.
Your brother attached himself to your grandfather's ankle?
Correct.
When you and Adam were young, did your mother ever leave you alone in the house?
Yes.
How often?
Well, she was a single mother, so when she couldn't find someone to babysit us, she would leave us sometimes for short bouts of time. And then there was an instance in New Jersey where she had left for a couple weeks.
Around how old were you when your mother left for a few weeks?
I would say like 12.
So how old was Adam at that point in time?
I would say 10.
And so during that time, you as a 12-year-old were in charge of watching your 10-year-old brother?
That's correct.
Was that something that that was normal in your lives for you to basically take charge of your brother's care?
Yes and no, yes.
Okay. And when you say that your mother left you alone, was that even earlier than when you were 12 or 10?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you Have you maintained a relationship with your brother since, as you've grown, even if you've grown apart?
Yes, through phone conversation or when I had lived in Pennsylvania for a short time before moving to California.
And you actually have a family of your own now, is that right?
That's correct.
Then Adam?
About a year and a half.
So if, as far as grade courses back when you were in elementary school, if you were in second grade, he would have been in first grade. You're one grade level apart?
I think we were a couple of grade levels apart.
Okay, so 2 grade levels apart?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you detailed a situation where your mother left you, I think you said you were at 12 years old, correct? And Adam was 10?
Yes, that sounds correct.
I'm talking about the trip that you indicated that she left the country.
Yes, sir.
And you were left alone in the house?
Yes.
You had each other though, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were able to take care of him during that period of time, right?
That's correct.
And he was able to help take care of you if you needed it, right?
Yes, sir.
Was that a scary time to be left alone like that?
Scary, not so much. Uneasy, a little.
Uneasy? A little bit of uncertainty as to what's going on?
And that's correct.
All right. Mr. DeJesus, as you sit here today, you served in the military, correct?
That's correct.
And which branch did you serve in?
Air Force.
And how long did you serve in the Air Force?
6 years active duty and still in reserves.
All right. And currently you are employed?
Yes, sir.
From the looks of it, you have a very beautiful family and a beautiful home, correct?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a medical equipment technician.
All right. And are those some of the skills that you learned through the military?
Some of the skills, troubleshooting, mechanical, electrical, things of that nature.
And you've been able to provide for your family and yourself, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect.
So that was the defendant's brother on the witness stand earlier today. That's direct examination. So you've got this parade of relatives and friends basically telling the jury, hey, look, I know this guy. I know his struggles. I know what he's been through. His life has been rough. Maybe what he went through with this family was just a perpetuation of other problems that he had in his life. And in other words, you can't completely blame the crime on the defendant. You also have to blame it on circumstances. I guess it turns into the perennial question, is one person responsible or is there circumstances responsible?
Does it take a village to create a murderer? And that's an interesting question because jurors obviously, you don't know what may hang that one juror. So we heard the brother testifying about being homeless, about being kicked out by the uncle, about the troubles with the mother. And so all that has to do is really resonate with somebody who has had those same life experiences and hang the jury. That's enough here. So with each person you put on the stand, you're hoping that they're going to connect with just one of the jurors on this issue. And again, everyone has their stories and their backstories, and if somebody was homeless even for a couple days or they had a mother that was a drug addict, they may be very merciful and they may say, I'm not going to do it. Life in prison is good enough. I'm not going to murder him, because it does take a village to create a murderer, and those people are liable. And my mother was awful, and maybe my life would have turned out differently if I had an uncle who actually let me stay with him, or maybe if they weren't homeless and it sounded like there may be enough facts to maybe just get that one juror. That's all you have to do, Aaron, is get that one.
Yes, as long as it's not unanimous, it results in life in prison. So, if the jury, quote unquote, hangs, then the outcome is the defendant's life is spared and he spends it locked up. So let's listen to some of the testimony of one of the neighbors, and that'll help us get through the rest of the day.